could basically talk about anything in these evening sessions, right? I mean, you can talk about anything and just see if anybody else finds some things interesting that I find interesting. And so I want to talk about something this evening that is not the kind of thing I would probably normally preach on, just because, I don't know how large of a mass market there is for this. But as I was thinking about all of the conversations that I'm seeing, the arguments I'm seeing in the news media and on social media and basically everywhere, it just got me thinking this week a little bit about one of, I think, the quintessential problems in Western society. And I think it ends up then being a quintessential problem in the Christian church, but we don't recognize it that much as such. And I don't ever hear hardly anyone point this out. And so it could go by a number of names, but I would call it dualistic thinking. And so I'm not the only one, it's not original to me, but I thought that tonight I would take just a few minutes to talk about non-dualistic thinking versus dualistic thinking. And we would see why I think that this is a major problem and why I honestly think that this issue ends up contributing to a ton of the tension that we feel within the United States today, and a ton of the tension that we feel then within the church that's in the United States as well. So if that's interesting to you to see, I don't think there's any silver bullet, by the way, as to all of the, political angst and cultural tension. There's no one reason for that, but this is a big reason. It's not the only one, but it's a big one. So I want to introduce it by showing you some things that Jesus said, because I just think that Jesus has so much to teach us about life in every facet imaginable. And so I want us to look at a passage from his Sermon on the Mount. Again, if you've never read this, it's Matthew chapters 5 through 7. If you would set aside some time at some point to just read through those 3 chapters, and if you just never have the opportunity to read the teachings of Jesus, you're going to get most of what he taught distilled down into 3 chapters in the book of Matthew. And it really is imagine as you're reading through it, imagine if the world actually operated like that. Imagine if people actually lived like that. It would be hard to think of a more beautiful society or group of people, or relationships or life that could be lived individually. So Matthew chapter 5 through 7, just highly invite you to check that out at some point. But this is a part of what he says. And he says this in towards the beginning of it. And he's talking about the law, right? So he's talking to a group of Jewish people, and he's talking about the law that they have, the legalistic law that Moses came down, and they ended up being taken. And these words ended up even being taken and turned into even many more laws. And the rabbis fought about specifically what those laws meant. I mean, by the time he gets the first century, Jewish people are trying to live their lives by something close to 600 plus laws. It's exhausting, right? And a lot of times when we talk about Jesus, we talk about how the law passes away. And there's truth to that. But I want us to look and see what he says here in Matthew 5, 17 and 18. He says this: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." Now, I have seen this preached on, and in ways that cannot possibly be what Jesus meant when he was talking here, because of what he says later and then what he does, right? He says, I haven't come to abolish it, I've come to fulfill it. Now, there's nothing of it is going to pass away until everything is accomplished. And it's hard if you're thinking in duality, and duality says there's 2 things, right? It's either this or it's this. That's dualistic thinking. It's simplistic thinking, and it's super important. In fact, until you get dualistic thinking down, you can't possibly move beyond it to non-dualistic thinking. We have to be able to say okay, there's 2 things, and this seems more correct than that does. And that takes, you have to be able to understand law before you can transcend law. You have to be able to understand legalism before you can transcend legalism. So for some of you who grew up maybe in a Christian environment, maybe you grew up in a church where faith was just about following rules. That was all it was about for you. And so you saw that and you thought, well, that's not very compelling to me after a while. Like maybe it was helpful for a while, but at some point it became, especially maybe when you became a young adult, that just didn't seem very compelling anymore. Like if this is all this is, just following rules, then that's not that enticing. But for many people, that's where they have to start. Like coming into a right relationship with Jesus is actually not about following rules. That's not primarily what it's about. It's about receiving love. It's about who you are, and it's also about giving that love to other people. And so it really ends up being about both of those things. And for you to truly be able to do that, for you to truly be able to both give and receive love, sometimes you have to start with law. Sometimes you have to start with, okay, I was addicted to this, or I was treating people in this kind of way, or I was really struggling with X, Y, Z, like whatever it is. That's where I was. And now as a first step to following Jesus and receiving his love, I should not do those things. I was living like this, and now I should live like this. You almost have to make it legalism for a while you're figuring out the rest of it. At some point, you figure out it's not just about the rule following. Like if that's all Christianity is, it's not going to feel very fulfilling. At some point, it can't just be about the rule following. You start to go, I'm actually being transformed into a whole different kind of person. Not just a person who says, I'm not going to do X, Y, or Z. I'm actually becoming transformed to the kind of person who doesn't even want to do X, Y, or Z. And that's when you start to realize like it's actually not about following the rules. It's about the kind of person I'm becoming. But sometimes you have to get the rules down in order to transcend the rules. Does that make sense? So that's a way to think about dualistic versus non-dualistic thinking. Jesus is coming to say like, I haven't come to abolish the law. And so many people would read that and they go, okay, great. So all of the law, we should still uphold it. We should still live by it. We should still, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of it still applies to us. But then he goes on in this same chapter, just a few verses later, and he says this, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, right? So the law says this, the law, right, that I have not come to throw out. The law says this, except I'm going to tell you something different. I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. Raka, by the way, it was like a first century word. It was like giving the bird, right? It was like flipping someone the bird, but verbally. So if you say to a brother, Raka, it's as if you're passing judgment on them. It's as if you're hating them. And anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fire of hell. In other words, he says like, look, you've read the law, you're familiar with it. Look, this is what you've heard of it, but here's what I say. Or, and I didn't put all of these in because it's a long sermon and I didn't want us to go through all of it. But this is a thematic way he goes through the next several chapters. You've heard this. The law's told you this. I'm telling you this, right? It's over and over again. So you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I tell you, if you even look after a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. You've said, do not break your oath. I tell you, like don't even swear an oath at all. Like that's like, just don't even go there. Like don't swear to God, essentially, that X, Y, or Z is going to happen. You've heard eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I tell you, actually forgive other people. Don't resist an evil person. Like they're going to punch you on one cheek, you turn the other cheek to them also. Like it just goes on and on and on, right? So it's really hard if you're thinking only dualistically. It's like, wait, but he said the law hasn't passed away, except he said he supersedes it. But see, this is non-dualistic thinking. Jesus isn't doing away with the law, but let's go back. Like let's go back real fast. I have not come to abolish them, right? Verse 17, but to fulfill them. In other words, like what I've come to do, it's not to abolish it. It fulfills it. And in its fulfillment, much of it will be different. It'll be lived out differently. It'll in many ways pass away because its whole purpose was to give birth to this new covenant. Right, so now we're into non-dualistic thinking because the law is both continues to be relevant, but it's also not holding us to the same standards it once was. It's not applicable in the same way it once was. There's maybe a better way of saying that. And so, like a dualistic thinker says, well, either we follow the law or we don't. Non-dualistic thinking says actually the law can still exist and take on a new form and a new function and be fulfilled in a new way to where we still have it, but the way that it operates in our lives is very different than it was before. We both have it and it's transformed. We both have it and we don't have it at the same time in the way that we once did, right? Like that enters into non-dualistic thinking. That's more complicated. It's far more nuanced, and therefore it's far more difficult to wrap our minds around. So I think there's an author who wrote a book that I just think pretty much everybody should read, and it's called Falling Upward. His name is Richard Rohr, and again, any book that I ever tell you like you should read this book does not mean I agree with every author about everything that they wrote just because I recommend a book. So Richard Rohr and I don't see eye to eye on everything, but this book is one of the best. It's one of the best books probably that I've ever read. It's one that I come back to on a pretty much annual basis. I often recommend it to people. And here's what Rohr, he actually doesn't say this in Falling Upward, but he talks about this concept in Falling Upward. And here's a great way to think about it. He writes this: the dualistic mind is essentially binary, either or thinking. It knows by comparison, opposition, and differentiation. It uses descriptive words like good, evil, pretty, ugly, smart, stupid, not realizing there may be 100 degrees between the two ends of each spectrum. Dualistic thinking works well for the sake of simplification and conversation, but not for the sake of truth or the immense subtlety of actual personal experience. Most of us settle for quick and easy answers instead of any deep perception, which we leave to poets, philosophers, and prophets. Yet depth and breadth of perception should be the primary arena for all authentic religion. How else could we possibly search for God? Now, this is such a huge concept, and it's so important. And if you could wrap your mind around it a little bit, if you could start to implement it into your life, you would realize every day you are surrounded by people and media that see the world almost exclusively through dualistic thinking. So let me give you an example. I think the world is incredibly boring right now in so many ways. And it's not just because I'm locked at home. Here's why. Our country has become so politicized like that. And here's the thing. We live in a country that is two parties, right? Republican Party, Democratic Party. All right. That's where we live. So it is the perfect mixture for dualistic thinking, because this party says this and this party takes the opposite stance, and there's no other way to think about an issue, is essentially how we're hardwired and programmed to think. So here's why I think we're so boring right now. If President Trump says something today, as soon as I hear it, I know already what about 98% of the country thinks, because about, 45% of the country agrees with everything he says, and about, and the rest of the almost everybody else doesn't. Like that's kind of like where we're at this point. Anytime you hear a statement from a politician who is strongly Republican or strongly Democratic, you already know what almost everybody thinks, because most people, are either going to completely agree with them or completely disagree with them. Wait, he said that? Well, then totally no. Like I would have even considered it if I'd have heard somebody else say it, but not if he says it, right? Or he said that, well, then I totally agree. If a Democrat had said it, I would totally disagree. But because he said it, I totally agree. This is dualistic thinking. And so our conversations are far less rich than they should be. So let's take a really close example, right? All around the country right now, state governments and local businesses and nonprofits and churches are having the conversation like, when should we reopen? And it feels like almost every place that I hear the conversation taking, where it gets most heated, is people saying like, we need to fully reopen, and you're violating our constitutional rights, and everything's bad. Or on the other side, you often hear like, we need to keep shutting down, and like there's plenty of middle ground here on a spectrum between shut down and reopen, right? There's 100 ticks between those two, at least, maybe 1,000. And most people aren't having the conversation about like what it should look like at different levels and areas. It's mostly anger and agitation. I'm not saying, by the way, that those conversations aren't happening. I'm not saying that people aren't talking about it in that way. I'm saying that what gets the most news media on it, and therefore what sparks the most social media conversations, are the extremes. Why? Because the news media is built for dualistic thinking. I mean, we're totally built for it. Imagine that, right? Like, it's more interesting when you have two talking heads fighting for opposite positions. Even ESPN, which used to be a sports channel, now it's just like, it's argument shows all day, and it's two people taking opposite. Who's the greatest basketball player of all time? Well, it's either Michael Jordan or it's LeBron James. And let's just rah, 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 right? And we won't talk about, it's just who's the greatest. Why? It's more interesting. It's more interesting to lots of people because it's so easy to get your mind around. You can kind of barely listen to that LeBron James versus Michael Jordan fight happening as you're shaving in the morning and kind of get in on it. Whereas if you were to talk about the nuance of their games and you were to talk about, what LeBron James does, with his passing versus Jordan and who was the best defender and why and physicality and who had the there's a thousand ticks of conversation that could happen in the midst of that. But all we want to do is jump to the end. It's dualistic thinking all the way down. So, what I hear preached most often and what I see people talk about, like Christians, most often, we actually tend to see the world largely through whatever political lens we see the world. And so a lot of people, I'm not saying everybody, but it's a lot. And as a pastor for 15 plus, 16 plus years now, I can just tell you it's a lot. A lot of Christians I know of see the world way more through their political lens, whatever political party they're a part of, than they do the Jesus lens. What Jesus calls us to, and why this is so hard for us, Jesus is constantly calling us to find a third way of thinking about things. He rarely answers questions straight on. He rarely, when two things are presented to him, pick this or this, he rarely chooses one of those and often pushes people to think a third way. That's the power of non-dualistic thinking. And it can allow you to transcend in your own mind the conversations that are happening all around you. When you see that bickering and that arguing, you start to pick up on it almost immediately once you've trained yourself to kind of think in a different way. And here's all it takes. Push yourself outside of the either or choice, the binaries that you're offered, and just ask yourself the question, is there another way of thinking about this? Or are there degrees between this option and this option in ways that I could think about this? If you start to do that, you will start to see how silly some of the fights that we've had in Christendom and outside of it are. They'll just start to almost be amusing to you at times. And then you'll start to feel sad about it. But I do think that this is helpful because you're going to hear, we're moving into election season, right? You're going to hear nonstop. There's only two ways of thinking about every issue under the sun. And political parties come in packages. You may agree with 70% of the platform of one party, but you should probably rightly disagree with at least 30% of it. And if you can't get into a non-dualistic thinking place, you'll just buy everything that they sell you hook, line, and sinker. Remember to follow after the kingdom of God, not the kingdoms of this world. Remember to first and foremost have your allegiance to Jesus, who invites you to constantly be reminded that you have heard it said, but I tell you. And you have to hold both of these things in tension. And there's no way to do that without incorporating non-dualistic thinking. So weird topic maybe tonight, and it may raise all kinds of questions for you. So feel free to put questions in the comments or to private message me. And if this is an interesting topic, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it this week. Or maybe all of you said this is not what I was looking for tonight. That's fine. It's a Monday, give me a little grace. And I hope that this was an interesting conversation. I will talk to you tomorrow, 9 p.m.